Hey everyone, you're listening to Film Philosophy, where we break down the philosophies, concepts, and structures of filmmaking in the American film industry. We are filmmakers Tiffany Francis, Andrew Coles, and Nzinga Murray. Film Philosophy is brought to you by The Mission Entertainment. Today's episode features R.J.O. Young, and the topic that we are tackling is 1970s New Hollywood Movement. RJ is an actor born and raised in Los Angeles. He received his MFA in acting from USC's School of Dramatic Arts in 2018. RJ often credits John Cassavetes and Martin Scorsese as his favorite filmmakers. We chose RJ for this topic because he is someone who watches a range of cinema and cares deeply about films that are more unconventional and take risks. We've actually had this conversation before on a more informal level, so I thought I'd bring it here for our listeners because right now seems to be a very tough time for a lot of people in our industry. I'm really hoping that this topic brings us all some hope in what could come. All right, so welcome, RJ.
Hey, how's it going?
All right, so we're going to get into it. RJ, can you first describe what Hollywood looked like in the 1970s?
A lot of cocaine. Look, it was kind of like, I would say, the 1950s. It was everything that wasn't the 1950s. Not kind of like, it was everything that wasn't the 1950s. Just picture a Norman Rockwell painting. You know, if you want to think about the idyllic suburban perfect home and everybody's around Thanksgiving dinner and everything is, idyllic. The 60s and 70s was like someone getting dog shit and then just smearing it all over that because it was much more of an extension of the counterculture that was a reaction to post World War II. It wasn't just the film industry, it was a whole movement at large. It was a whole generation of young people rebelling against these institutions that they didn't trust. So having a job, a steady job, a union job, and two kids and a house in a suburban area was not good enough. People were looking for meaning and purpose, and that was by and large an extension of the film industry, and it was a reflection of that. There was a huge disconnect amongst, I would say, the greatest generation, as they call it, post World War II, and the baby boomers. Because there's this huge divide between what's valuable, what isn't valuable. These are the rules, and the baby boomers are like, well, why are these the rules? And so it is by and large an entire movement, I would say. And so if you look at a very well-known movie like The Sound of Music, by the time you get past then, people are realizing that that way of living is not what they want. And so they want to live a much more subversive life. I mean, the greatest distinction between the greatest generation and, I would say, the baby boomers is just a distrust in the country. Because if you look at it, you had Vietnam, you had the civil rights movement, you had Watergate, and so all of this fueled an anger of we can't trust the people in charge and we have to fight for what's ours. And you have this sort of older generation, they're making movies, but the movies aren't speaking to the young kids anymore, and they don't know what they're doing, they don't know what to do. And so you have a whole lineage of musicals and historical dramas that would make money and be successful. They weren't making any money anymore. So you have like these younger kids going, well, people are dying in Vietnam, and yet you want us to watch Hello Dolly. What is that? I don't relate to that at all. And so the movies weren't making any money during that time. And you had basically three facets overall. You had the advent of television, so people could stay at home and watch entertainment. You also had the falling of the studio system. So the old movies that were selling weren't selling anymore because people just didn't relate to the stories that were being told. And then another big factor that happened years before, I would say, the late 60s is you had this thing called the Hollywood Anti-Case Act in 1948, and it was passed by a Supreme Court Judge, William O. Douglas, and it basically prevented movie companies from owning their own movie theaters. And once that happened, the movie theaters could show anything. So these movie theaters were showcasing foreign films and independent films, right? So then you have all these young people watching European cinema, relating to those films more than they would the standard Hollywood film. So you have filmmakers like Scorsese and Coppola, Spielberg watching Jean-Luc Godard, watching Francois Truffaut, watching Antonioni, and they're realizing that those are the movies we want to make. And so that was what broke the dam, is the exposure to another world, exposure to a completely different way of making films.
Wow.
That was a little bit long-winded, so
No, not at all. And I love the way that you walked us through that. And I think, knowing about Paramount decisions, sort of knowing about basically, what was an anti-monopoly law that was passed to break up ownership of distribution and production. I had never thought about it in terms of, oh, this opens up these theaters to independent films and to foreign films, and just the ways in which the strict control that Hollywood and the studio system had over what American audiences had seen was beginning to break down, and I think that monopoly that had existed for, the previous 40 or so years is starting to come apart at the seams. And I think one of the things that we always love to do on the podcast is to think about the artistic impulses and also the business impulses. We live in, or we live, we live and work in a commercial artisan industry. So we can never get too far away from the business decisions. So
yeah.
I really love the way that you framed that for us, and just this idea of those directors who we see as that generation that came up in the 70s, thinking about what they were influenced by and how that came about.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, when it first started out, the old studio heads didn't know what to do at that point. By 1963, the old studio system was dying. They were shutting down studio lots. They were taking down sets. I mean, they basically kind of gave up. What they decided to do was, these young kids know what's popular. We don't relate to their movies, but they're making money. So if I give someone like Warren Beatty $1 million to make Bonnie and Clyde, I might not like the movie, but it's going to make us 60 to 70 million dollars. It was just simply giving up, saying, we don't know what we're doing. You guys figure it out. And from them figuring out, they kind of developed their own genre, and it was basically breaking all the rules that were set beforehand. Another big thing too I forgot to mention is you had the Hays Code. After that Supreme Court case was passed with the antitrust law, you had an opening showcase for all these foreign films, and they didn't follow the Hays Code. So you could see nudity, you could see sex, and it just, they realized they couldn't regulate all this stuff. So it basically, they switched the Hays Code to the age-based rating system in 1968. So once people realized you could see boobs in a movie, they're like, oh great, well, we're going to show whatever we can. So we're going to show drug use, boobs, violence. And so it basically was a retaliation over all the restrictions that were made.
Do you feel like there's something that defines films sort of being released during this time?
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple things. The main thing are the rules. Like if you look at, narratively speaking, traditionally you have a good guy and a bad guy. You have the leading man, you have the character actor. All that kind of went away. The sort of narrative functions of each character would change. You can make a movie about a bad guy, and you could humanize that bad guy, and people would like it. The first person who did that was Warren Beatty. His career was plateauing. He did a movie with Elia Kazan. It got some recognition, but his career was hitting a standstill, and he realized that he needed to produce his own film. He came across a script, which was Bonnie and Clyde. Legend has it that he backed Jack Warner in the corner of his office and offered to kiss his feet to give him the money he needed to make this movie. And when that movie came out, it popped, because here you have two people, they're bank robbers. They're not necessarily good people. They kill innocent people while they're robbing banks. But people still cheered for them. They still were on their side. They still liked them because you had these human moments. It was sort of a change in cinema that way, because the bad guy could be the good guy could be the bad guy could win at the end of the movie. So it was changing what was sort of good and evil and flipping it on its head. Narratively speaking, that's how it changed. But also in terms of production. You know, a lot of these movies that came out early on, a lot they didn't have a big budget, so they couldn't build a set in a studio. So they would have to shoot on location. You know, there are a lot of creative restrictions they had to work with, and they basically stole from the French New Wave and a lot of these European filmmakers. Roger Corman, who made a bunch of B movies during that time, you know, you would be the camera operator, and then you would also be the crafty guy, and then the actor would also be the guy that helped move the light stands, you know. So the rules were all kind of just didn't apply anymore.
I'm really fascinated by, the picture that you painted for us of the ways in which culture was shifting from the post-World War II period and sort of the economic boom and sort of the age of conformity into the 60s and the 70s, this generational gap that exists, the creation of counterculture and the rise of counterculture. But I'm really, and I want to double click on sort of this idea that you have of thinking about the ways in which simultaneously there's the cultural shift, but then there is also, the abandonment of the Hays Code. And we talked a lot about the Hays Code in the first episode that we did and sort of the origins of it. So it's fun to revisit and think about how the industry was shifting in the moment when the Hays Code was falling out of favor. And I think the thing that strikes me is that if we think about the war that America waged in Vietnam as, in a lot of ways, the first televised war, and there was the newsreel footage of American flag draped coffins coming back, there were journalist teams that were embedded with soldiers, and those images were being beamed back. In some ways, it starts to make Hollywood of the golden age look a little sterile, look a little silly, look unrealistic. And I think in some ways, if we think about the cultural component of, okay, we've just come out of the Second World War, things are good, America's an emerging world superpower, this idea of how that image starts to curdle and how in some ways the industry was lagging behind what audiences wanted to see because they were starting to see unsanitized footage of war, unsanitized footage of what life was really like. And so to think about this idea of, no, we want to see what it really is to be alive. Can you give us something that actually reflects our lived experience?
Yeah.
It's interesting because I think we're always in this cycle within the industry where the industry is trying to figure out what audiences want.
Yep.
And it's a little bit of the tail wagging the dog, perhaps.
Yeah.
We have this very isolated class of people, studio heads and sort of everyone beneath them, who is trying to understand the trends. But in some ways, consumers and audiences vote with their dollars.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about this decline of Hollywood's output, and I pulled a little bit of research, on this, but it was talking as by 1970, weekly film attendance was down to nearly 1/4 of post-World War II audience, approximately 20 million people per week.
Yeah.
In the immediate period post-World War II, film was huge, cinema was huge, there was no TV, as you had mentioned, so 80 million people were going weekly to the movies.
Yeah.
By 1970, that was down to about approximately 20 million people per week.
Yeah.
And studios were forced to cut their yearly releases from nearly 450 yearly releases in 1959 to only 200 in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this idea of, feeling these constraints, feeling this business pressure, along with the cultural pressure, leads to this really interesting perfect storm.
Yeah.
Whereas you said, those who had been in power and rose into those positions at the top of these studios were out of touch and out of sync, and the model that they had built was no longer operating.
Exactly. Yeah. And people were saying that it was the death of Hollywood during that time too, which is funny because we're having that same conversation now. It's always about the money, man. It's always about the money. The moment something is not successful, they're forced to take a risk. They're forced to make a decision to change. And that counterculture during that time, that was it. It's funny because people, in a way, they watch a film to relate to themselves. They watch a way to connect with where they are in their own life. That's the reason why a lot of these films, like Easy Rider, for example, that's not a movie I like, but it was revolutionary when it came out because people were relating to those characters. It was the first time they saw people do drugs, smoke marijuana on screen, and people were like, "Oh, they're like me. I want more of that." So there was that kind of need to be recognized and need to be seen and understood and related to.
Yeah. I love it. I love the 70s.
Yeah.
And I love the film that came out of that period. I wanted to ask you, how do you think this period of cinema influenced the rest of films moving forward? Do you feel like there's a change that was created? What was the effect of this time period?
it's kind of like what we said earlier a little bit. Like it changed the way stories were told. It changed the way a narrative was told. So the rules of this is the protagonist, this is the antagonist, protagonist wins and gets the girl, that all flipped on its head. And from that, you had a lot of interesting character dramas that came out. I know personally for me, like all my favorite, a lot of my favorite movies come around that time. But even if you look at the body of work that came out then, I mean, even all the great filmmakers that we all revere, they all started around that time. But I would say, in terms of the films themselves, they'd be much more darker. They would be a little bit more character driven, and they'd be so dark and character driven that it ended up being a copy of itself. By the time Driver comes out, and the French Connection, it got to a point where everybody was wondering, like, are these movies about sad, lonely men with their problems? But it became a trend where it was a character study. It was much more subjective in terms of like what you could do in the editing room.
Yeah.
You didn't have to put A and B together to tell the story. You could put A and C together. You could chop up the editing. You could play with, the timeline. You could mess around with it, because back then it was just, we tell the story A, B, C. Now it's like, well, A, C, D,
Right.
B,
Yeah.
and that's the movie. Or, the first half of the movie was a dream sequence. This spawned off of the French New Wave and Italian neorealism, where they were breaking all the rules. They were doing whatever they wanted because they were so bored of the old Hollywood way of making a movie. And all these young people took those ideas and made it into their movies.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, what about like the infrastructure, like the studio system, or I guess how things are distributed or how things are made or greenlit? I guess, do you feel like there's any change in that regard?
I mean, basically they had a bunch of mavericks run the studio. It was kind of in a way where like they had the money and they would say, you know what, this guy has an interesting idea. Well, we know this guy. Let's give him a shot. And so the interesting about Hollywood during that time is there was no distinction between like the classes. There used to be a vertical hierarchy back then. That all changed. So the producers and the actors would all be hanging out together, and one guy has an idea and they're like, okay, that's a great idea. I'll give you some money. Go make that. And so it was much more communal in that way. The distinctions weren't so clear. Jack Nicholson would be hosting a house party and you'd see everybody there. You would have band members from the band, and you would have Roman Polanski there, and then you would have Warren Beatty there, and then you would have a bunch of producers there, and they'd all be doing drugs. They'd be doing questionable behavior, but everybody would be working together in tandem. And it really depended on like who got the money. If you had the money, we'll make it. And so people were much more open-minded. People that ran studios were much more open-minded. They gave the auteurs and filmmakers all creative freedom. You asked me the question, like, what was an important distinction about the 70s is films were much more personal because auteurs were given free creative control to do whatever they wanted. The studio did not get involved. They could tell stories that they truly felt was true to them. And so that's the reason why you have a lot of interesting narratives coming out. Something that you wouldn't script, where you would have a writer be commissioned to write a story, and then that would be checked by the executives, and then it would be okay. It was, here's some money, do you have a script? And the person would write the script and they'd be like, okay, well, let's go make it. It was a lot like film school in that aspect. They even interviewed Scorsese. They said, why were the movies in that time so interesting? He's like, that's because it was all personal. It all came from a personal space. It all came from our own personal lives. And we took our personal lives and we wrote it down on paper, and people gave us a chance to make those movies.
It's so interesting because I think there's a rising tide in the 70s where, we see, I think as you've drawn out, sort of auteur-driven films, that are very personal, that find this cultural resonance, that does lead to box office success. But then if you think about, Spielberg making Jaws, in 75, if you think about Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark sort of coming, in the years after that, early 80s, but you have Star Wars in 77 with George Lucas. There, in some ways, it feels like a light bulb goes on in the back half of the 70s, where these studios realized that what we would call blockbusters, or what we deemed blockbusters, were really in their infancy and their birth. And so it's such a fascinating period in filmic history and in Hollywood history, the rise of these sort of, in some ways, dueling, and competitive approaches. But it's interesting when we talk about cycles. And I think so much of, what you said about the advent of television, and a lack of people going to movie theaters, I think we felt in our own way in, these last 5, 10, 15 years. And thinking about, when there was the first fears that Hollywood had about the advent of television, that's when we saw the invention of 3D films. That's when we saw, smell-o-vision,
Yeah.
And Panavision,
Yeah.
large format experiential theater going. And it feels in a lot of ways the last 10 or 15 years have been a resurgence of that. If
Yeah.
we think about that period of time where every movie was in 3D, even if it didn't really make sense, but like, yeah, make it 3D. We'll do it in post. If we think about large format, if we think about 4DX and the seats that move, and in some ways it's this idea of, can we turn the theatrical experience into an interactive ride that you might see at an amusement park?
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel like our industry has embraced the other side of that lesson that was learned in the 70s, which was, hey, what if you invest in auteurs' visions? What if you invest in filmmakers and artists who are saying, I'm going to make this personal thing. It's drawn from my experience. I don't need a lot of money for it. And I think it was Cord Jefferson, when he was accepting, Best Adapted Screenplay at the Oscars this year, he said, instead of spending $200 million on one movie, what happens if you spent $10 million on 20 movies?
Exactly. Yeah.
And that feels like the missing piece that our industry doesn't know how to contend with or doesn't want to shift into.
Yeah.
And I wonder, and I posit, and this is a new thought, but it's like, I wonder if it's in some ways, if we think about who has control of studios now, and then if we think about the 70s, they were largely standalone organizations whose, number one purpose was to make films. And then we think about the ways in which film studios were bought and incorporated into these multinational corporations.
Yeah.
Thinking about Columbia, being bought by Sony, thinking about all of the acquisitions. Like, we're now in a place in 2024 where most studios are part of a larger corporate infrastructure.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so we get to this place where it is not about vision. It's about bottom line and delivering value for the shareholders.
Yep.
And so
Exactly.
it feels like our industry has shifted into something that is very different than what our predecessors, who were in a very exciting period in the 70s, were dealing with.
Yeah.
And it feels in some ways like the corporate mindset is leaning so heavily in terms of, well, we need to do reboots, remakes, franchises, universes.
Yeah.
That's the way to pre-sell awareness. But I think conversations like this give me hope in this idea of, I think it's why we're having this conversation of, what could an alternative to that look like? And I think, again, if we look back to this period, which was inarguably one of, the greatest periods of time that the American film industry has ever seen in terms of output, in terms of resonance, in terms of the number of films that came out in the 1970s that were genre defining, genre exploding, were films of a moment in a generation. It just feels like our industry can be so much greater than it is. And it feels like the economics can work if you're not spending an absurd amount of money on a single film or a single swing.
200,
but
300, $400 million.
Diversifying that risk.
Yeah. I also think that an important distinction was they were all somewhat in the same space. They all kind of hung around each other. They were all kind of together. So the producers and the directors and the actors and everybody, they probably all slept with the same girl. Like, it was all communal, so they all kind of knew what was going on. They all knew what was popular, and they were all with each other. Now it's a little bit different, because I say now you kind of have people, I can't speak on behalf of every person, but you have a lot of people now that are sort of coming in and they're in charge of a studio. They've never made a movie. They never were on set. They've never written anything. They never directed anything. They never acted anything. They went to Harvard Business School or some Ivy League business school. They're good at reading spreadsheets. And then they're thrown into a position where they got to make a decision. And once they make a decision, that decision will basically be decided whether or not the shareholders will be happy next year. So that's just a different space. Everyone's a little bit more disconnected. So I really think that art has to be a sort of a communal, it has to be where people do together. It's got to be a team sport where everybody's working in tandem with each other. And I think now everything is so separated, much like the beginnings of the late 60s. You have these studio heads not knowing, not even hanging near these younger creatives. They don't know what they're like. They don't know what they're into, trying to make decisions to convince them to go into the movie theaters.
I love the idea of what, or just how you frame that. So many of the projects that I work on, when it does feel like everyone is really working together, including the people at the top, that's when it really feels the most organic, and you have the best results in terms of the film. Thank you so much for laying that all out for us, RJ. I wanted to turn this over to the present. For anyone outside of the industry, you might have heard that our film and TV industry are in a quote unquote contraction post-strike. And honestly, like whenever I go to any industry related events, it's pretty much what everyone's talking about. How it's a really weird time in the industry, how it's really difficult for so many of us who are out of work. And I feel like everyone really relates to existentialism because everyone's telling me that they're essentially in an existential crisis, because this is, working, being creative, working in the film industry is what they love to do, and some of them can't do it in terms of actual work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I can relate to that. But I do think that regardless of how hard this time is, we really have to find some hope. And that's kind of why I thought about this topic, is because thinking about the 70s independent cinema scene and how that panned out, is there a way that we could relate that time to our current times?
Yeah, I mean, kind of, I think we might have mentioned it before, but when things rise, they have to fail first. So things have to not be going well in order to convince others that things have to change. Going back to the fall of the studio system, things weren't going well. And for things to get better, they have to fail, I would say. My dad tells me, like, whatever goes down will go up. Whatever goes up will go down. So right now we're at a down, I would say. Everything's not looking prosperous, but I really do believe that's going to force people to really change their mindset. So I do think that things will change for the better in the long term. I don't know how long, but I think that we're creative human beings and storytelling is innate with us. So we were designed to share, and movies, I believe, really speak to us. Storytelling's never going to go away. As long as we exist on planet Earth before we get taken over by I think storytelling won't die. Now, in what form, I have no idea. Because it's different now because we have the internet. And is the internet new Hollywood? I don't know. I really don't know. But I do think that making things, showing things, expressing yourself, that's always going to be there. There's always a need to express yourself. And I think creative people, because they're creative, will find avenues to share themselves to the world. Yes, things are on the low and we don't know what it looks like. I do believe things will change for the better. In what form, I don't know. I have no idea. Is it going to be like Hollywood in the 70s? I can't say. But I do think that we are going to find a way to have another renaissance.
I think the renaissance that we're going to see, I really hope sooner
Yeah.
rather than later.
Me too.
I do think it's going to be even more beautiful than the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get me wrong. I love thinking
Yeah,
about the 70s, and I love that period of time. I love the fashion. I like the vibes of it. It suits me and my personality. But I do think that there's a lot more that we have now, which is, we've had the Me Too movement. We have a lot more diversity in film. We have a lot more different types of filmmakers that are, like so many generations before us have fought the good fight, and we're seeing the results of that now, like in actual greenlit films, TV shows, stories that are being told. They're a lot different than what they used to be. And so
yeah,
I actually think that we're in a better place and we're going to see something more beautiful. Again, like you said, I'm not really sure exactly what form that's going to take, but I do like to imagine it. And I think that we should keep on trying to imagine that, because you have to believe in that vision to see it happen.
And I'll add on to that. We have this sort of nostalgic perspective of the 70s, and it's important to note that it wasn't perfect. By all means, it wasn't perfect. There were still a lot of its issues that were there. Directors were given so much power to do whatever they wanted, and unfortunately, that wasn't regulated. So people, especially women, were exploited. You had what happened in Last Tango of Paris with Marlon Brando and that young actress. Sam Peckinpah. These guys would go on binges of cocaine, alcohol, and they're in charge of a 10 million, 30, $40 million production. And that's also another reason why the era ended, because a lot of these people were living in debauchery, sheer decadence. They kind of did whatever they wanted and nobody would tell them no. So there was a dark side to that. I think Dennis Hopper did like 3 grams of cocaine, 30 beers, some marijuana, and Cuba Libres all in like a day. So there was a lot of decadence that was there. None of that power was unchecked, unfortunately.
Yeah. I think that will be different moving
Yeah,
forward. I
yeah,
mean, the
exactly.
next generation of filmmakers, I think, is a lot more about self-care.
Yeah. There's so much that we don't know of what went down in the 70s because Twitter did not exist back then. There was no iPhone to record anything. But like everybody would be hanging out in Laurel Canyon and God knows what was going on. Like they'd be at Jack Nicholson's house and everybody's doing blow, and the next Charles Manson shows up and is partying with everybody.
Hmm.
So there's something that we enjoy about it because it's advertised to our generation. There's something warm and appealing about that time, but there was actually a lot of dark stuff going on.
I'm struck by something you said in the question that you posed, which is like, is the internet new Hollywood? And I think it's something we've talked a lot about on this podcast is what are the downstream effects of the democratization of content creation and distribution?
Yeah.
So the fact that what an entire, studio apparatus was doing in the 70s, if you are enterprising, you can do on your phone.
Mm-hmm.
You can do on your personal computer
Yeah.
in terms of shooting, editing, distributing, marketing. But I was just struck. I saw a headline from Variety today talking about why long form TikTok videos make perfect sense. And this idea that TikTok is experimenting with allowing users to upload videos that are up to 60 minutes. And so it's interesting to think about the evolution of these platforms, right? Where you have YouTube as the OG, which sort of, I think, really kicked off this renaissance of like people being able to post videos of length and creating a platform for people to stream those. But then YouTube feels the pressure from TikTok, so they institute YouTube Shorts. And then you have TikTok going the other way where it's first a minute, then it's 3 minutes, then it's 6 minutes, then it's 10 minutes, now jumping up to 60 minutes. And this idea of the ways in which I think these new players, and which you might even call new studios, which if you think about how they operate, YouTube has had its creators program and they have a team, at TikTok that interfaces with creators and helps guide them, give them strategy, gives them favorable placement, or sort of boost their videos within the algorithm. So there's something really interesting about this idea of, and it's a conversation for another time, but it's this idea of like, can Hollywood go back to where it was?
Yeah.
With the proliferation of TV, with the proliferation of streaming. When we think about not only all of the specialty channels, but then if we think about fast channels, free advertiser-supported television, where you have ION doing 24-hour streams of NCIS or Law and Order SVU, this idea of our choices are so bespoke. And there's so many different options that we can access at any moment. It's like I can get off of this recording and I can go watch any film that's ever been made with reasonable availability. And I think pirating is coming back. It's really interesting to say, it's like, are we chasing faded glory? And in some ways is part of where our industry goes forward, embracing not only advancements in terms of storytelling and meeting audiences where they are and giving them what they want. But also thinking about where we deliver that.
Exactly.
And I don't know. I mean, I think so many studio releases now are focus tested, and the marketing department comes in. They're like, we're going to place ads here, and we're going to do an ad, at the NBA playoffs. We're going to drop an ad at the Super Bowl, and this is our rollout, which is, in some ways like an analog strategy.
And it doesn't sell.
Yes. And I think we live in a particular bubble in LA where we drive around, we see all the billboards, we see all the marketing. That's not a lot of people's lived experience outside of this bubble. But I'm just really struck by continuing to pull this thread. And it's one that we've been pulling throughout this podcast. And I think you gave us an additional pull here, is this idea of what would it look like to radically reimagine the future that we want? And I think in a lot of ways, it requires probably a degree of humility on those folks in the industry who know everything, and that knowledge is aided by big data and the algorithm, and being able to say, oh, well, we can see that viewers logged out after watching 3.5 minutes. So the opening of every movie needs to be explosive. But I guess I just have all these thoughts swirling around now. It's just like, man, can we ever go back to the problematic good old days? Or is it the responsibility of filmmakers and creators of our generation to really be pioneers. And in the same way, Scorsese and Coppola and Lucas and American Zoetrope, all of these guys who we put a lot of respect on their names, like, what does that look like in our modern context?
Yeah,
Which feels like a challenge and an invitation.
exactly.
Which is really exciting.
It is very exciting. And there's also the fact that we have all this content out there to distract ourselves with. But there's still a lot of movies that do well. And a lot of those movies are not produced by the big studios. The film Challengers did very well. That was an original film I haven't seen in a long time. You look at a lot of movies produced by A24. Yes, they have a few duds, but a lot of them make a lot of money. I still think that it could be a fact that we have so much content and nobody knows what to watch. Nobody knows what is the thing to go see. And so maybe you still need a curator to help you make that decision on what to go experience. And so that could be another side of the coin that we don't know about. It's very up in the open. Like, we're kind of in the wild, wild west. We don't know what things are going to be like. And we just kind of have to go through it. Only when we get past it will it make sense to us.
The one point I was going to make is I think the thing I take solace in is the fact that humankind has always had a storytelling instinct.
Mm-hmm.
So I think anyone that is saying this is the death of storytelling, this is the death of art, it's an ahistorical point.
Yeah.
Whether it is a shift in the role that Hollywood has played within American culture and within worldwide culture over the last 100 years, I think there is a lot of evidence to point towards, we are coming and emerging into a new era. But I take solace in the fact that it's like, look, cave paintings, sitting around a fire, the amphitheaters, of ancient Greece, thinking about Shakespeare putting his plays on. Like, we've always had this impulse because story is how we make sense of the world.
Yep.
And despite the amazing advances of AI, large language models aren't necessarily prying at the reality of what it is to be a human being. And I don't think that function can ever be replaced.
I think so too. I think there's something unique about being a human being, and I don't think there's anything, at least in the near future, that can replace that. People give the younger generation a lot of hate because they're saying their attention spans are not like what they used to be. And I don't know the science behind it, but they could sit through a 3-4 hour movie about a guy who built the atomic bomb. They could probably sit through a 2-3 hour podcast. It's because they relate with the subject matter. So I don't think the attention spans are the issue. I think it's just people want to be connected to something that they can relate with. And that was exactly what happened during the 60s, 70s. People wanted something in which they could be seen in. So I think there's a connection that's there. And we're communal creatures. We all want to connect in some form, in some way. I think films do that for all of us.
I love that. I think you kind of answered like the call to action section, actually. Which is
really?
Yeah, unless you have something else to say, we always have like a end to this podcast, which is to leave our listeners with an action plan, those who are listening.
Oh, yeah.
Whether there's someone with real power in an industry or someone who's like on the ground, on the grassroots level, what are real actionable things that people can do? What are solutions and ideas that you have for change?
I mean, for people who still need to create and want to express themselves, write the script that you want to write the book. And look, I don't know what the future holds and I don't know what it looks like, but if you are a filmmaker, hang out with other filmmakers. I would say hang out with other writers, directors, film your own little community. I don't think that you could do it on your own. You need a group of people to kind of be inspired by and inspire. A lot of these filmmakers we talk about, whether it's Spielberg, Scorsese, Coppola, Brian De Palma, they all were friends. They all helped each other. And when one got through the door, they would make sure the other one got an opportunity. So if you look at Coppola, when he did Godfather and it became a huge success, he wanted to make sure his friend George Lucas can make his own little crazy sci-fi space opera, and so he wanted to make sure that all their friends got opportunities. So I mean, what I would say is just don't think you could do it alone. Find your group of people, inspire each other, and maybe one day somebody has an idea and then people go and they make it happen. They make it work. One of my favorite filmmakers, John Cassavetes, and he always found a way to express himself. Not because he necessarily cared about making the money. Whether if he had to lie to somebody to get the money, he would do it. But there was always a need to express himself. And once he made a movie, it permeated everybody and inspired the next guy, his friend, to make his own movie and that own person to write his own movie. And so, yeah, you have to find your tribe.
100%. Do you have any last philosophical musings on our topic You like to end with an inspiring thought.
What goes down will go up. I don't know. Because we're talking about the 70s, I'd say history repeats itself, but not in the same way. We never know what things are going to be until we look back on it. I think just embrace the unknown, embrace the uncertainty of things, and don't give up. Just keep moving forward, and things will happen. As cliche as it sounds, I think my acting teacher told me, he said 20% of it is talent and 80% of it is fortitude. How long you could stay in this business, like how long you could stay doing what you do, because so much of it is just hanging in there. And a lot of people that I talk to that are industry veterans, they always tell me I wasn't the most talented person, I wasn't the smartest person, but I hung in there, and then I found a way through.
I believe that is true. Thank you so much, RJ.
Yeah.
And before we end, I do want to say, to our listeners, like, we are touching so much on the surface level right now in terms of like the history of cinema and 70s, and even like the 60s and how that affected the 70s and how the 70s affected the 80s. And I think that there's so much to learn from and to get inspired by from just studying some of this stuff. There's so many resources that you can find out there. There's so many great documentaries, so many awesome books to read, or just watch movies from that time. Think about how that could apply to maybe your work today. So just wanted to give you guys some inspiration to go look and see what educational resources are out there. Again, thank you so much, RJ. We really appreciate you.
Thank you, RJ.
Yeah, pleasure.
Thank you all for listening to this episode of Film Philosophy. We had a really amazing chat. And as Tiffany mentioned, we just started scratching the surface, but it really is a period of time that bears some investigation. And there are lessons to learn that we are still unpacking and are still unfolding. You can find our website at filmphilosophy.com. That's film and then philosophy with an F.com. There are educational resources and links there. There is the email address, filmphilosophy.tme@gmail.com, for any listener questions or follow-up. If there's something that really resonated with you or something that you'd like for us to tackle in a future episode, feel free to shoot us an email. Thanks so much for listening. We had so much fun with this topic that we kept talking after we wrapped the episode. So please enjoy some bonus content from our chat. You can find it on our website, filmphilosophy.com. Again, that's film and then philosophy with an F.com. We also have an Instagram where you can find us at film.philosophy. This is Film Philosophy, and we'll see you next time.